All right, let's get right to it. Susanne and Jovana, I'll start with you, Jovana. There are two terms we use to put on top of this evening: staging feminism. We'll come maybe to the German mistranslation later. I'd like to focus a little bit on the first part of the term, on staging, and ask you, Jovana, what does staging mean to you? You have to turn it on.
I have to turn it on?
Yes.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, cool. That's the first question. Okay. Staging. Yeah, so as you have seen, or maybe you haven't, I work with professional actors and non-professional actors, so I try to stage something, or try to find something very authentic and inauthentic at the same time. I don't know if this is going the right way now, but yeah, that's it, I guess. So that's what I'm trying to do with staging. Any more questions about it?
Well, yeah, maybe a little bit. There's, I think, a feel that the city you use and you show is a stage in itself.
Yeah, it could be. That's true.
Did you think a little bit about that, about the different aspects of stages you put your protagonists in?
I mean, I tried to do a cool movie in Munich, which is kind of hard at the same time and also funny because Munich has such a bad image, and so we tried to find something great in it, and then we at first we wanted to do this very fancy, glamorous Heimat or neo-Heimat film in Bad Gastein, in a very, very beautiful city in the mountains, and then depending on the lack of money, so we had to go to southern Bavaria, to this very weird place, Bad Füssing instead, and we couldn't afford the noble hotel, so we got the cheap one, the cheap Bayerische Hof and not the grand Bayerische Hof. So yeah, we tried to work with that, and of course it's very theatrical in a way, and all this garden or the park where Linda is trying to find Max, for example, it's so beautiful, but all the people were just staring at us because we wouldn't fit in. So yeah, I try to use the different environments as possible stages, or even the hotel is so cheap, it's so 80s, but still we're talking about a situation in 2017. So yeah, I try to, I don't know, find something interesting and combining all these different worlds. So I don't know if this is going the right path right now.
Yeah, Susanne, can you maybe chip in a little bit about the staging of your movie? I mean, obviously it's very visible. I mean, it's the staging aspect of it is forefront. Can you tell us a little bit about how you conceived the staging?
First of all, I have to turn it on. I did turn it on. First of all, I must say that the script was the first thing that was there. So every aesthetic choice that we made basically came from questioning the script. So I, for instance, looked at the dialogues, and it was clear that they can't be spoken in a naturalistic way. So I asked myself, okay, how can they be presented? I talked to a professor at DFFB, Isabel Stever. She said, read Brecht. It has something to do with the script, so read something about Verfremdungseffekt. And then I took this path, and so the whole process was like a Forschungsreise, like a, how do you say that?
Research journey?
Yeah, and we just tried to find...
Did I mistranslate? I'm sorry.
I don't know. Well, so I waited very long until I finally made a decision, and of course the staging. I mean, sometimes in some scenes you can even get a sense of me saying "und bitte" at the beginning, so it's clear that this is all just presented to you, and it's not there's not something happening at this moment, but it's it's quoted. There's this very nice quotation by Brecht. He says something like, I have to paraphrase it. He says the actor mustn't seem as if he is living through something in the moment, but he must show what he really is. He's quoting. And so that was one aspect, and it was very clear that that the episodic structure and also the character, that this is just presented for you, which is also based on Brecht's conviction that identification can not only be like a emotional Übertragung, but also like finding yourself within the structures that are presented to you, and positioning yourself within the structures that are presented to you. And so this very kind of theatrical Guckkasten thing, it was clear that we had to do this, and also we wanted to avoid the filmic illusion of you can schwenken to the right, and then this world continues, pan to the right, and then this world continues forever. But we wanted like the opposite effect, that when you pan to the right, then there's a light stand or something. So it all belongs together. We kind of created a whole system where all these different elements, like the framing and the costumes and the scenery, kind of communicate with each other. So every decision that we made also had consequences for all the other elements. I talk too much. I go back to drinking.
You don't. Nina, maybe you can get onto the two terms and how you reacted seeing the two movies together with this staging feminism.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess first of all, I just want to say I really enjoyed both films, and I think there's something extremely interesting going on at this level of a certain kind of like feminist surrealism and a certain relation to a very particular kind of humor that partly comes about in relation to this messing around with genre and playing around with cuts. And I think particularly in Susanne's film, this kind of almost like this sort of Netflix of the soul, these little fragments, these kind of like, as you say, Brechtian, and I was thinking more of the kind of fragment in the sort of German romantic sense, you know, the melancholy as this kind of deep feeling, but is somehow performed in this kind of very, very staged and sort of alienated way. And I think, you know, I was thinking about Bungarten actually, and this kind of like reversal of sort of bourgeois norms and the inside becoming the outside in a certain way. Also Monty Python, which is very Bungartian, a kind of feminist Monty Python. And there's a British TV comedy show called Smack the Pony, which is very much about gesture and patterns and a certain kind of a sort of slapstick, and it's kind of an all-woman sort of comedy show in it. And both films actually had this sort of dimension of the kind of, you know, the sort of deliberately awkward, like the kind of like the blasé as this sort of like very, very strange kind of oblique intervention into what it means to like perform, you know, to be a good feminist subject, or to be a good worker, or to be a good, sexual object, or to be a good like, walking CV or something like this. And I think in Susanne's film, there's also this kind of element of the internet sort of feeding back in, not just the Netflix of the soul idea, but also this sort of idea of like vaporwave and this particular kind of aesthetic, you know, that comes from like back from the internet, which is a kind of, you know, very, very clean, very sort of staged, weird memorialization, right, of the internet itself, like in the form of the statues, in the form of these kind of like odd poses, and all of these sorts of things. And yeah, I mean, in terms of staging feminism, I mean, what does it mean to do that? I mean, in a sense, that kind of oblique humor and that, I don't know, questioning of appearance, of structure, of genre, of the cut, you know, in cinema itself. I mean, what else are you going to do in a certain way? Like, it has to kind of be this sort of oblique thing. And I think in that sense, like, both films are very, very effective. Both one in the kind of more outside, you know, what does it mean to like be outside, to be seen, to be sexy, to be I don't know, given a hierarchy, a position of hierarchy and rank, and this other one in this kind of, yeah, like who is watching, who is seeing this kind of peripatetic, melancholic woman, you know, wandering from room to room, you know, this question of female happiness. And, you know, in a sense, I saw your film as a sort of response to Lars von Trier's Melancholia, you know, where, of course, this is a hugely dramatic, end of the world, apocalyptic type film, but in a sense, your film also ends like it glitches to death, you know, in this kind of like...
It's much more intelligent than
oh
the
yeah,
Lars
no,
von
no,
Trier,
of course, that
course.
goes without saying. I mean, yeah, look, of course.
I Lars von Trier. Who hates Lars von Trier?
I knew you would hate
Thanks,
Lars
guys.
von Trier. But in that sense, then it's like a much better version of Lars von Trier. That's all I wanted to say, in the sense that it deals with, like, you know, the end of the world, you know. It's easier to imagine, you know, the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And I suppose this very famous paper in recent years, you know, about the decline of female happiness, you know, that there is, that I'm sure you've read, you know, this very famous publication, which talks very precisely about this this question, you know, why are women becoming more and more unhappy, and where is the space and place, indeed, for a I don't know, to address this melancholy, like in a full frontal way, you know, not in therapy, not in sex, not in, I don't know, somewhere else, no? And then maybe this question of warmth, maybe in the question of the collective, you know, is there any outside in your world? I mean, your film is very closed in that way, like it presents a very, very closed world, you know, that only ends in a glitch. And I don't know, I mean, the first film too, I mean, I don't know, the outside, the great outside, where is it? All right, the end.
In which way would you relate to the two films?
Well, speaking in general terms, for me, I think sometimes our expression today has gotten to a sort of cul-de-sac where there's nothing beyond it. There's no road ahead from here. And my interest has always been in rediscovering old forms and reusing old forms and studying them and appreciating them and trying to reuse them. And in my case, it's been going back to the literature of the past, going back to Jane Austen and other writers of former eras, and trying to bring those to the screen. And in terms of cinema, I think if we go back and look at the early films of sound, the films of sort of 1932, 1933, we really can see sort of fascinating narrative cinema and what they were doing and what they're doing with great economy. And my world is sort of narrative cinema. And I imagine there are a lot of filmmakers here, and I think, you know, when we're making films, we're sort of starting from scratch, where we have to begin anew. And I found the studying of the silent film era, the very beginnings of it, particularly helpful when you're sort of conceiving what sort of film you're going to make. And so there's one great text of that period. It's Kevin Brownlow's "When the Parade's Gone By." And it's a very long book covering the whole sort of time of silent cinema. And in that, I think you see so many sort of forms and people discovering those forms, and that we can kind of rediscover those forms of narrative cinema and tell stories that are really remarkable and reach inside ourselves, but also, you know, an audience and audiences all over the world. So I think staging, we can use old forms.
But relating to the two films we just saw.
Well, I don't see the path ahead from these two films exactly. I don't see like what you make next. So I prefer to be in my world, which is narrative cinema.
I think we should get over stories.
I don't think so.
Do you want to respond a little bit more?
I know. My doubt about narration goes very long years back. I was a writer before. I published 4 books. 2 of them were novels, and they were really bad. And I thought I had a problem with the form, but then I realized no, it has something to do with that I don't feel they are adequate for my feeling in this post post-democratic, post-whatever world. So there's something that does not match. So I tried to understand this discomfort, and I read a lot of like Walter Benjamin and like, very different stuff, and then I discovered that I think most of the stories that we also see in cinema are just there to like comfort or to comfort, or and I think that's a wrong thing to do in this world that we're living in. So I think what's missing right now is films that find the ability or find the right language to empathize structures and to make an uneasiness in society that is widely spread and that I share with many people to make it productive. And I think stories, and I don't speak about narration, I mean there are lots of like small narrations also in my film, but I think like story should not be like the I don't know, this oberste Ordnungselement, so not the thing that everything else is untergeordnet.
The main, the main element of structure, maybe.
So yeah.
The main element of structure. Jovana, how do you relate to this? Because I mean, there are also some references I see, at least, whether they're intentional or not, in your film.
Tell me more. Tell me more. What did you see?
Well, especially I saw a reference to Munich filmmaking of an older era, especially of the 80s, and maybe it's only the characters in Munich.
That's easy, yeah, but keep on going.
Well, I'm wondering, especially how much you work with the stories from that time and inspiration.
Yeah, well, we tried to make something. I mean, when we found the aesthetics, when we really wanted to do something which looks like something very easily to understand, but also misleading. So we chose the aesthetics of TV or soap operas. So, of course, and Munich, as you all know, has this Key Royale glam world, this cheap glamour, this promise of money and success. And we tried to put all these things and nuances into this project, which isn't just this one, this film, it's 3 more. So we tried to put these basic Munich ideas and I don't know. We tried to put all these old stories or references into this project. So of course, I used some of their stories. But on the other hand, we tried to make something new, of course, and we tried to make something contemporary. And I wanted to actually talk about the framing, because I tried to tell a story which is not in the frame, which is beyond the frame. So this is quite interesting. When you said that you were, there is the stand, the light, for example, or you could see the camera guy or woman, and you could see the team, the crew members. And I always try to tell the stories which are somewhere else, not in the story, not in the film. So this is quite interesting. So maybe you want to talk about more about this or not? I don't know. Is there something else? Not now. Okay, good. Yeah.
Nina, what does it mean to try to go beyond the stories? What is that a political enterprise, do you think?
You asking me?
Yes.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think I think it's really important to recognise that there is a possibility of critiquing particular narratives. I mean, the narratives on offer, right, to women, to everyone, are generally terrible. I mean, they're awful stories, right? They're kind of very, very banal. They focus on what you look like at a particular age. They promise you certain things, like a false freedom through paid work, or a kind of through an algorithm who chooses who you go on a date with, for example, that eliminates risk, which is a key part of one of the later scenes in Susanne's film. You know, this idea of a kind of life that is narrative is actually what the lie, in a sense, right? What does it mean to choose against a particular story and to create your own sort of rituals, let's say? This question is raised in the film. The catastrophe has already happened. There are no climaxes, no development, no plot. We've lost time and place. So the ritual and the kind of the special quality of things, places, people is something that has to be generated, right, through experience by ourselves, by each other, together, and so on. And like this question of temperature is very important, where one is warm, where one is cold, whether one feels, if you think about what melancholy is, melancholy is like an object you cannot give up. It's a lost object that you can't kind of get rid of. You're trapped in this this state, and that state, like today, might be something like, like in the film, between idealism and pragmatism, let's say. Like, who are we in this kind of, this sort of structure, in which our freedom that is sort of like sold to us is like nothing more than this kind of freedom to like, fuck who the algorithm says we should fuck that evening and watch Netflix and watch some sort of, crap narrative. And so I think like to critique narrative, in the name of a structural criticism is exactly the right thing to do in a certain way, and it points towards a different kind of freedom, a different kind of like disintegration, like of the story, and in this kind of humorous way that in itself like incorporates and critiques like previous genres, right, in a fragmentary way. I mean, it seems clear that both films are doing this in a really like interesting way. It doesn't matter. No, I'm nobody.
I thought you all read our program carefully. I'm sorry. So, let me please introduce them again once more. So, Nina Power just spoke. Nina Power is a philosopher and social theorist from. No, it's not wrong. From Great Britain. And Whit Stillman is a film director known for latest film was Love and Friendship. Before that, Damsels in Distress. His first feature was called Metropolitan, and he did Barcelona in between, and a film for Amazon, a pilot which was Cosmopolitan, or Cosmopolitans. Yeah, okay.
Now you know.
Whit, I have the feeling that you don't agree so much with what has been said so far.
That'd be right.
Yeah,
it's true.
Okay. Let me try to understand what your position would be, because I think that there are some things you like to work with that are also echoed in these films, even though they are very different from yours, obviously. Especially when you deal with we had just the term of melancholy and also the term of stereotypes. I think there are both things that have a role in your cinema.
Well, there's been a lot of deprecation of 80 years of cinema, and I think in the course of 80 years of cinema there have been a lot of beautiful and wonderful and communicative narrative films that don't meet what Nina thinks films do. And
I like those films too, but I'm just saying we can do
really?
other things.
Okay. So I mean, I don't understand where certain forms lead ultimately, and I think that the forms that have been established can be re-explored and redeveloped, and that very often going back into the distant past we can find things that can be inspirations for us, and where they can communicate things that are meaningful for us and helpful for us, and I think being comforted occasionally is a good thing in cinema, and so my orientation is towards films of the film tradition.
And where would you think that your cinema would lead? Because you just said those don't lead anywhere, or you don't see where they lead.
I think you get to the end. So sometimes you sort of get into, I mean, is it seminal art or is it sort of terminal art? Like, where do you go from there? Just do the same thing again? I mean, I don't find anything in the two films very surprising. I mean, it's not communicating, I mean, to me, and I think probably to a lot of people. I don't know.
Well, I find the films quite surprising. So I don't know. No,
the perspective is almost a cliche perspective.
What do you mean?
Against society.
Which one?
It's sort of exaggerating, dehumanizing, Everyone is mocked, and people aren't even allowed to talk. There are scenes where people are just shut up. We can't even hear what they say because we just dismiss it. So I think it's a very conformist point of view.
Conformist to what?
Conformist to point of view in this room. So I think a lot of people agreeing and mocking everyone else and mocking people with babies and mocking. So I think what was nice in the film.
Sorry, I have a baby and I'm not mocking people with babies.
Okay.
I'm
the babies were
talking
good.
about
The dog was
I'm
good.
talking about structures and personality and how personality is or how the individual subject is constructed in neoliberal society. So it's basically a Sittengemälde of neoliberal Western bubble, white bubble.
I don't know how to
So
translate Sittengemälde. Does
I'm
anyone
sorry.
know? Sorry.
So this kind of exaggerating or alienating is part of the mechanism that I aim at, that I told you before, like making uneasiness, a discomfort productive, because I believe in the beyond or in the outside, and I'm working on it, like very concrete, in a very concrete way, by living together with feminist anarchists in Leipzig and like trying to find new things. And I think I don't really understand the question where it eventually leads to this kind of filmmaking. I mean, I get a sense of there is this superior form, and this kind of makes me very skeptical, because that's also what people say about heteronormative relationships or something like that. They say, oh well, like these hippies tried it all in the 60s and it kind of failed, so you should just not experiment, because there is a superior form of how people should relate to each other. So I'm always very skeptical when I hear this, and I don't want to. I mean, I don't want to agitate people with this film, but I really still believe in the emancipatory power of art. I'm romantic in this sense, so so what I really try is to aim at a different kind of effect. So I'm sorry that you could not relate to the film, because it's not that I want to avoid having feelings for the film, and I don't think the film is cynical at all. So I'm not a cynist, and I think the film is cynicist. The film is neither.
Cynical.
Yeah, and yeah, that's some of the things I wanted to say. I'm sorry for my English. I'm not. I'm like 20% as elaborate as in German.
Yeah, can I just say something briefly on this question about stories, the idea that stories and narrative is comforting? I mean, in a sense, like, stories are not comforting. I mean, stories can be, like, extremely alienating. Like, if you're told the same story over and over again, whether it's a romantic story or a heteronormative story or a teleological story in which, one is redeemed by a particular thing that one does, these are actually, like, brutalizing stories. These are stories that, like, hurt people very much, actually.
You said it was bad because it was comforting.
Huh?
You criticized narrative cinema because the stories were comforting.
Well, I'm saying that they're, comforting stories in inverted commas are not always comforting.
Not for everyone.
No, I mean that they actually make you feel maybe sad, melancholic, precisely. And why not
dysfunctional?
Or dysfunctional, or that you've done something wrong. That the narrative of your own life, right, is wrong in some ways. Cinema is this very, very dominant series of fantasies and images and imaginations, and to retell the same stories over and over again, of course, reinforces particular kinds of behaviors, desires, what people want from their life, who they think they are, and I think to remain in this difficult space, which is perhaps an unfinished space, right, a non-teleological space, which tries to look at the structure that creates particular subject formation, is a much harder thing to do, and a much more open-ended and a much more interesting kind of project, that it allows for precisely this other space of imagination, this other space of experience, which is happening now, right? This is a question of zeitgeist. The aesthetics of both film, are kind of referential. Of course, they're referencing the 70s, the 80s, soap opera, vaporwave or internet kind of imagery. But they kind of precisely allow for something beyond. I think they're kind of provocative in that way, and also like they open up possibilities, you know, precisely in their kind of, you know, open-endedness. You know, that seems to me revolutionary potential, or let's not use that word, but, you know, something like something different, you know, not the same old story, which doesn't comfort.
Do you find yourself, Jovana, in this, in what Susanne and Nina described as an emancipatory project?
Yeah, what else should I say now? I mean, yes.
You don't have to agree, I don't know.
Yeah, that's true. You wanna fight right now. No, yeah, but I do. There's nothing more I can add right now. So, yeah.
Thank you. Good night. No, we should go.
How do you see, I mean, I think we had this idea of programming these two films together also because we thought that they're quite different, actually. They might have some points in common. You just talked about some of them. But I'd be really curious to hear you two, how you viewed each other's films. Whether, what? No? Yeah. This is not something you want to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I have seen this film for the first time right now, so it's really hard for me to talk about it. Usually I need some hours to process, so we can try. Maybe you start.
Yeah, it's the same with me. I always take some hours to think and process, but I found them in a way kind of, or the first feeling that I had was that they were very similar. But it was just a feeling. Just a gut feeling. I can't really can't really say why. Maybe because of exactly the thing that we talked about. That is also a kind of no to classical narratives and stuff like that. Of course, it has on the surface the same subjects, but I think that's not the point. I think it has also something to do with, of course, the very artificial staging, also maybe the camera work, and also you found a very specific way of acting, and that was also something that we were searching for a very long time. Yeah, and it's also a no to like naturalism, and I don't know. Yeah, this is like very superficial what I say right now. I have to think about it more.
A question for Susanne. Stylistically, I suppose it was conscious that you were trying to use some of the sort of the techniques of very sort of high-end, beautiful commercials to make things have that look, starting with the backdrop, very much sort of an advertising backdrop. And I mean, that is admirable, the sort of beautiful use of those images, that style, sort of an anarchic commercial showreel with the information. Was the script yours, or? Yes, yeah. Okay.
My question was about the differences you could perceive in each other's films. Maybe Nina can add some.
Yeah, well, I mean, I did see similarities, to be honest, and I think it's to do with this particular, perhaps like sort of feminist or surrealism, or like, you know, some of the, and this kind of oblique humor, that, you know, also playing around with sort of psychoanalytic categories, like the superegoic, like the superego voice in the first film, and then the, you know, I mean, obviously the therapist scene, the analyst scene, where he's looking at the cosmos. Again, I thought this was maybe a mocking Lars von Trier, but maybe not. Let's leave him out of it. And better. Yeah, better. And but you know, the question of melancholy, you know, as such, right? You know, this is a core kind of psychoanalytic category. You know, her kind of you know, relation to this problem, if you like. Like, you know, she's blocked. She can't finish her novel. You know, she's stuck on the same sentence. It's kind of, yeah, this repetition, right? Pattern repetition. You know, this is what is permitted. You know, this is sometimes described as freedom. It's not really, you know, what do we do with this this kind of structure precisely. So yeah, I don't know. I thought they were in a sense like, I mean, visually different and so on, but like addressing something quite similar, like in a very sort of I don't know, like yeah, provocative and interesting way, in a way that is not yeah, it doesn't need sort of plot in a certain way. I don't know, and like this is the sort of strength of them, and I think they're very funny as well, like visually funny. The gestures are hilarious. You know, like what does it mean to have this kind of body language? You know, which we all know. And like, for example, to get the man to pose in the way of the the paintings. You know, to have the man as the kind of the visual object. You know, I mean, these are kind of feminist tactics, but you know, they're done like, I don't know, very, very well in both films. And so I saw them like together in a certain way, you know, not to undermine the differences, but as doing something like, you know, this oblique project, you know.
I just had one idea. Maybe both films are also about making a shift from putting really much responsibility on the individual and trying to make a shift to no, it's a structural question, because actually both of the main characters are kind of trapped in these bigger narratives. I mean, like the melancholic girl tries to be the best melancholic girl she can be, and the other girl is like tries to be the or I don't know, sexy vamp or whatever. That's maybe not the best expression, but whatever. So she also tries to, or there's also a kind of narration that she should follow or something. And what I'm also trying to do is, of course, getting a different perspective on personal crisis, because I don't believe it's a personal dysfunction or something. And the first time I stumbled across some feminist artists who kind of worked on the subject of politicizing feelings or public feelings, politicizing negative feelings. This really was an eye-opener for me in terms of, okay, well, I can't only look at depression as a personal dysfunctionality, but maybe individuals just express a structural problem. So, you know, like nowadays they say that like 30% of us are depressed. I'm one of them, and I thought it would be there's a big need to get all this responsibility from the individual and to put it back where it belongs, to politics and structures, to make this addressable. That is what the film tries to do. So not really criticizing in the old-fashioned way of the critic, like doing blaha. I lift the curtain and I point on something, and because the critics' gestures are also from yesterday. They are also like outdated in a way because they're always a step behind. But what I want to do is like thinking. I try to form or to formulate something so that it becomes addressable. Yeah, sorry, I can't explain it better right now.
No, I think it's very important to read the films in this context of having feminism as a part or of an anti-capitalist or anti-consumerist idea of critiquing different aspects, that gender stereotypes are not something that you separate from the rest. I think that's...
Yeah, that's exactly why the film begins with this chapter, Feminism for Sale, because I think that is one of the dangers of this queer pop feminism right now, is that it is so easily anschlussfähig an Neoliberalismus, because it is like this choose who you want to be, choose your choose what you want to be.
Can be connected
like
easily.
So yeah, it can be connected easily to neoliberal understanding of how the self is constructed, and so it kind of loses the potential of for social criticism, and that is also something I want to remind ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why, for the German title of the evening, we chose to use Feminismen vorführen, which means as well to show, but also to critique it, or to lay bare what feminism can be like. And I think both in your films, and I know from your book One Dimensional Woman, you also think about how feminism can be co-opted by other discourses that are actually maybe anti-feminist, or at least don't further the same progressive goals. Yeah.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, like, it's obvious, right? I mean, yeah, like, of course. I mean, like, there's a banal way in which we can say, look, everything can be co-opted. You know, of course it can. You know, this is how it works. You know, this is what consumer capitalism is. It's the construction of new desires at the level of, like, the erotic. You know, if you eliminate the space of imagination, you fill it with whatever junk you like. You know, you can create particular kind of subjects. And you know, yeah, of course. I mean, feminism itself is not immune or exempt from this. You know, sort of machinic process in which everything is kind of eaten up and sold back to you, you know, in a lying sort of way. And I think, you know, the question of the collective, or what would it mean to have a kind of feminism that is really truly critique of structures, you know, is the important one in a way, because of course there's the first step, which is to say, well, look, you know, feminism is a brand. You know, like, things can be sold to you as feminist things. You can say you are a feminist as an individual or something like this. But what does it actually mean? I mean, it doesn't really mean anything. I mean, you can say you're X or Y, you know, unless there's a kind of, a sort of dimension of structural critique, which says, well, look, how are these sorts of things reproduced every single day in terms of, you know, who we're supposed to be, what we're supposed to want, you know, if it's just something to buy, of course it's not a political project, it's a consumerist project, you know. And so to differentiate between, you know, what is a product and what is a position and what is a force, a political force, is like important in the first place. I mean, you have to do that, you know, not to mention the use of feminism to wage war, for example. You know, feminism as a Western imperialist project as well. You know, it's not simply a consumer choice. And, you know, I mean, that book I wrote is really old now, and in a sense, you know, it was talking about the branding of labor. It was like saying, well, how do you get women to enter into the workforce? Well, you brand work as a sort of, you know, emancipatory thing. You say, look, you can work for a job agency for, like, you know, very little money, and this is freedom. You know, this is what flexibility is. This is what it means to be a, you know, a great woman, you know, today, or a young woman in particular. You know, to make women the face of capitalism, you know, in a sense, that was the kind of project, you know. And so to, like, observe that and to try to, yeah, remain actually with this unhappiness, perhaps, you know, the unhappiness, like the fact that feminism is an unfinished project, you know, it doesn't culminate in capitalism, you know, it's not a success for women to, you know, get jobs and do this stuff. I mean, this stuff is, like, horrible, you know.
I'm going to open in a minute, so get ready for your comments and questions. Whit, I'd like to include you a little bit, because
you don't have to.
I know that I don't have to.
No need, yeah. Glad to step out.
I understand that you don't relate to the forms of the films, but there's a reason why we wanted to have you here.
Really?
There is, yes. I'm gonna divulge everything. So it's mostly about the way that you work with female characters, and I mean, in your last film maybe more so than in others, but I think that in many of your films, the way that you use female protagonists, and also I think of Damsels in Distress, for example, that you do think about many of the things that were talked about right now. I mean, you might not think about them in an anti-consumerist perspective, but you do have the milieu that you want to show, and the quests of these women.
Yes, I mean, so I am talking in the context of stories, but in the context of stories, I found as a writer, I struggled in my first film with different perspectives. And at a certain point in that story, the female protagonist's perspective, she didn't she became the female protagonist. She had been the object of the lead guy, and then
In Metropolitan.
but her situation was so much more interesting and so much more sort of pivotal to everything. Like I sort of knew what he was up to. It was really obvious. It's sort of things that Susanne described in her film, but it was much more interesting her position. And then in the third film, Last Days of Disco, I had the chance to have sort of two main female characters. And then in Damsels in Distress, and it was interesting, sort of the title, I think, of your film in German, because the home video company here, Sony, here said, you can't have Damsels in Distress, it'll sound like a porno. If you translated that into German, it'd sound like a porno film. So they had to have another title. They called it Algebra in Love or something like that. Yeah. And so I'm not sure if that word is something that it's only for porno films or something like that. And then in the last one, I went back to my favorite author, Jane Austen, and a piece of hers called Lady Susan that hadn't been completed by her, hadn't been published in her lifetime, and we made that film. And I don't know what it is that's liberating in these stories, the role and perspective of the women characters versus the male characters. So that is an interest. And I do have a sort of a boring filmmaker question for Susanne, because I really love the music and the sound. It's really beautiful, I mean, technically. And like, at what stage did the music come in? Was it coming in at all stages? Were you starting with a lot of that music, or was it coming in post-production or while you were shooting? Because it's really, really beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah, the composer is his name is Moritz Zembritsky, and he came in at a very late stage. We had already shot the film, but we knew that the sound would be this artificial. So on set we only recorded like the camera sound, and I was all the time talking, like lift your hand, lift the cigarette, bend over. And we also worked with the tick-tack metronome to be able to like apply the music afterwards very precisely. So a lot of the scenes were we played, or it's not really, you cannot say acted, it's more a choreography, but it was made on this metronome so that we could apply the music later. And then so we had the time when we really were focused on the picture, and then we had a lot of time for dubbing and for the sound, that like we recorded all the single signature sounds ourselves, because they were also supposed to be not the natural sounds, so that they are all a little off. And then I was initially, I was thinking about asking different bands and musicians that I knew to make the sound or to make the music for one of the scenes. But then I had the impression that it made the film like fall to pieces into short films, and I needed something to kind of hold it all together, but not in a narrative way, because as you can see, the music is not only there to underline the story or to deliver some emotion, but it is it's very autark. It is in communication with all the other elements, and it's commenting, and
and it's a humorous aspect also.
Yeah. We were researching a lot on circus music, for instance, yes, and then my regie assistant, my assistant director, Matthias, came up with the idea one morning, and he said, I know what you mean. I know what you need. You need a big band. And I was like, yeah, of course. Why didn't I have this idea like 2 years ago? Because it also brings this dirt of the analog instruments that is kind of missing in the pictures, because the pictures are very flat and very smooth and very ice creamy colors and very consumable. So I needed like a back world of analog dirt also, and of course it brings a lot of nostalgia and melancholy as well, because it's like it's an outdated form, the big band. So and a self-irony in a way, and also the story that is playing nowadays. It's also presented as it was. It is historized in a way, so it's told as a gone by story, and this also helps the effect that I'm aiming at. And so I kind of scanned the big band scene that surrounded me, and visited a lot of concerts and spoke to a lot of people, and then finally 2 different people told me about this Moritz Zambritsky guy, and I was at one of his concerts, and I thought he had a very great understanding of what pop is, not a certain style, but a certain access or a certain approach, how to communicate with people, and and he wanted to work with me, and so we worked on this for 3 months, and then we recorded it. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to open to the public just because I got to thinking of the comedic aspect of sound use, and I was very impressed, and especially in seeing your film again in the theater, Jovana, the way you worked with all the sounds, and how you create this tension between we're looking at something and we're hearing something else. When and how did that come to be?
Yeah, so fun fact, I'm married to the composer, so we were talking about the sound all the time. When I started to write the script, we were constantly talking about the field recordings we would use and how we would make the final, the music. And so, yeah, it was in there at the early beginning. Yeah.
All right, I'm having a look whether there's someone who wants to say something. I have one here. Can the microphone, I don't know who was first. I saw 2 hands, one here and one here. Let's go here first.
Hello, it's mostly a question to Susanne Heinrich. But it comes from your discussion about what is a classical form and how it functions. I was thinking that some of the ways in which a classical form functions is the identification. And your film opens with the female protagonist's monologue about identification, how she says that I'm not identifiable. I mean, I don't remember the exact words, but it's something that says nobody can identify with me. And I already find it a very interesting contradiction. I mean, internal contradiction, saying that nobody can identify with me is already something very identifiable. I mean, already it's something everybody can say, so it belongs to everyone. So it imposes in the film something which follows it, I find, all the way. I mean, a text superimposed on the film, a very clear film in its form, is an imagery. So we hear the text. It's a text on film. It's a text on clear images. So we hear a credo. And I mean, this is the whole functioning of a text, is the female protagonist explaining all the time through this text, which begins by the nobody can identify with me, and it follows up to the end. So do you find this, I mean, do you identify also with this contradiction I describe? I mean, do you find that this explaining or functioning of the text as an explanation is a form of a consolation, of a classical consolation?
Susanne?
Consolation? What is consolation?
Relief. Relief, maybe.
It's like the comfort we were talking about. To console someone is to ihm Trost geben.
I'm not really sure if I understood the question, but of course this first monologue is like a recipe how to read the film, and is like a poetological kind of introduction to how this film wants to be read. And I think it says basically, or it comes from what I said before, from the question of is this what we call identification today? And is this really all identification can be? I mean, like feeling with a protagonist that is standing at the window and there's rain outside and he's weeping and we are crying with him? Or is there more? Can there be something that can you apply this kind of identification to the story itself, so that you're not like only sad about or sad with the protagonist, but sad about that what is presented to you? And that needs distance. And that is what I try to recreate, because that's also something I see in neoliberalism, is that it's a very that we are in a mode of constantly being very intrusive, and also like this whole we are not living in the Disziplinargesellschaft anymore, but we are like the managers of ourselves, and also wir disziplinieren uns selber. So it's all internalized. And so what I try is to find or to recreate some distance, so that, and this distance of course varies. Of course, when you have the Bauarbeiter scene, you are more close to her, because it's the scene that is kind of made very differently. But I think in this distance, and that is something that also Brecht wanted. He wanted to make theater that that is not hypnotizing people, but you can you don't have to give up on your critical conscience to be hooked, but you can at the same time develop feelings and also be totally awake. And that is something I aimed at, and that is something she talks about in the beginning. But I'm not sure. I think my answer was pretty much off to your question, but okay.
I was just wondering what you're saying. I was wondering how it could function. I mean, when I said about consolation, it was really about guiding, and how guiding towards explanation. So if the mirror of if the film is mostly a mirror for the audience, so how we guide the audience to a lecture, and this meaning how, in this sense, how the text guides to a lecture of something.
I think this film is much more than a lecture. I mean, if I would have wanted to make a lecture, then I would have made a lecture, probably.
There was another question here. You wanted to say more? Sorry. I just want different questions to be heard.
I just wanted to say it's not really about guiding people, but it's more about a film constantly also saying in the subtext, "I'm a film." Like it's always like because that's one of the subjects that it is about.
Hi. I have one question, mainly directed at Susanne and a bit at Whit Stillman as well. I very much hear what you say about structure, and I very much what you say about Brecht, and about, and I very much see that reflected in the stiffness of the scenes and the episodic character. I was wondering why you still put so much one person in the center of the whole film. I mean, I see again and again one agent, and I was surprised that you said you want, and that you spoke about the structural problem, but in the film I again see one person as an agent, one perspective on the world in a certain way. There was a question to you, wondering why you made that, and the kind of the adjunct to this question to Whit Stillman would be, how much do you think this is? I mean, you put your kind of criticism in terms of absence of story, and I was wondering how much you think this is still a story element in this kind of film, or in this film specifically. Thanks.
Okay, I think There's also a line in the monologue. It says something about you can only learn from them about the time and place mirrored in their surfaces. And I think she's like the most logical figure that you come to when you want to speak about this white Western neoliberal bubble, because and now I have to go to one of the books that is briefly quoted in the last not the last, but in one of the last scenes when she writes the home trainer. There's this book by Tikkun, Grundbausteine einer Theorie des jungen Mädchens. I don't know the English title, but it says basically that maybe you remember more, but it's about this the young and the female like being like the Kriegsmaschine of neoliberalism, or like the I don't know, the Heroine oder das Aushängeschild, oder vielleicht auch das ist an so einem Schiff immer vorne dran. So it's about das junge Mädchen as a figure, and it also
the young girl,
the young girl, the la jeune fille, but it's junge Mädchen, it's not young girl, it's kind of different. It is. It's not easy to translate because there's a Bindestrich.
you know a translation?
No, but it's very important that it is not the young girl. It's the young girl. It's the. It's kind of how to say non-sexual or something. No gender. No. What is the word for it? Ungendered. Something between. So I think if you want to tell something about this time and this specific place, then this is like the logic figure that you come to. And also for me, it has a kind of relation to films like Wanda or Sue by Amos Kollek, or like films where also like the time and place is mirrored in one specific character. And also tries to find a certain Umgang with narration that is kind of referring to how people in these times navigate through life. So yes, there are like Überreste of story or of narration in the film, rests of narration in the film, but it's not the structuring element that is maybe important. Or I watched many Farocki films, and maybe it's a little bit comparable with how he structures films, because every element has to have a specific place in the film, but it's also working as a kind of system that gets, or as a puzzle, and is widening, or is you get a bigger picture with every scene that you see. So that was a way how we worked.
So there was a question to you, Whit.
Well, I don't.
You turn it off.
Oh yeah, I turned it off. Well, I really don't know what to say. But I was just thinking now. I have very unclear memory of seeing in the 1960s Godard's Pierrot le Fou. But isn't there something sort of in this world of cinema that relates one film with the other? Am I completely off? Was there something in those Godard films that was sort of deconstructing story, doing different things with story? So I do think that, yes, very interesting things, very admirable things can be done outside of the narrative form, conventional narrative form. It's just that I have to sort of, as a filmmaker, sort of see what paths are open to me and people like me. And I always go back into the story form. So I'm not a good commentator on the other films. But and I think that we were very excited, with those films. But then we didn't follow up with more films like that. We went back to the traditional forms. So I'm not sure if that's an answer, but that's all I have.
There was at least one comment here, or a question, sorry.
It's for Susanne. I think I was very early in the movie. I was thinking about tikkun and this theory, and I wanted to ask you, when did you read this book, and how important it was for the kind of structure of the movie, because it is kind of the theory itself is kind of only fragments. It's not a real theory. It's just kind of phrases and really not a logical structure. And this kind of form of the whole movie reminds me on this kind of theory. So I wanted to know how important this book was for you. And for me, it feels very like in the beginning of the book is kind of a manifest how to deal with this new theory. And I think you did it kind of interesting to put this idea in a movie. I never saw this before, so it was very, very good to see. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, the book came to me when the monologue was there. We had the first, test shootings in 2014 with another actress, and it was only the monologue for a seminar with Isabel Stever, who's right there. Hi, and it was and in the seminar we filmed the monologue. And there was only the monologue, and we had very long strolls in the park, Isabel and I, and we were talking about this character of the melancholic girl, and I think maybe the title existed. And then I presented the monologue, I had some more material, and I presented it to this actress that I wanted to work with, and she said, "Wow, this really reminds me of a book, you have to read it." And I read it, and I was so scared that it describes exactly the character that I thought I had just invented, you know. And I was like, oh my God, I'm rediscovering her. And that was super interesting. And I loved the book, but also it was like very different phases. There was a time when I read stuff and went to seminars and stuff, but then the actual writing was not like that I sat on a table with open books, but it was really there was this time when I read a lot, but then when I was writing, I was just I was like blind and just writing for a few days, and then it was there. So I was not working with the text while writing, but it had found its way, maybe not in the film, but also in my personality or in my thinking, because I always think you have to change, or you have to sich verwandeln to be able to make to transform, to make a new film. So, yeah.
Okay, I think transformation is a good end word. Thank you very much. No consolation from us, and some drinks outside. Our great book is is to be found outside as well. Thank you very much, all four of you. Thank you very much, Jovana. Thank you, Whit. Thank you, Nina, and thank you, Susanne.